On the morning of July 1st, 1898, a soldier named Isaiah Thompson stood at the base of San Juan Hill in Cuba and waited for the order to advance. He was a private in the 24th United States Infantry, one of 4 Buffalo Soldier regiments in the Army. He was carrying a Springfield Model 1873 trapdoor carbine chambered in .45-70 government black powder. The men on his left flank, regular Army troops, were carrying Krag Jorgensen bolt-action rifles chambered in .30-40 smokeless powder. The Army had issued those men their Krags 6 years earlier specifically to retire the .45-70 from service. The Army had failed to get enough of them built in time. So Isaiah Thompson stood in the Cuban heat with the rifle the Army had already declared obsolete, and he waited for the order, and when the order came, he climbed. That story does not appear in any Ordnance Department recommendation. The Ordnance Department would not have wanted it remembered. What the Ordnance Department wanted was a modern repeating bolt-action rifle and a smokeless powder cartridge and the old .45-70 buried in a surplus crate somewhere in an armory basement. What the Ordnance Department got was a cartridge that refused to die no matter how many times the paperwork said it was finished. The .45-70 government was adopted by the United States Army in 1873. The Pentagon has attempted to retire it from American military service 5 separate times across 150 years. The cartridge is still in active use today. That is not an accident. That is an argument about what makes something worth keeping and who gets to decide. You need to understand what Erskine Allen was working with before you can understand why the .45-70 proved so difficult to kill. Allen was the master armorer at Springfield Armory in Massachusetts in the last years of the Civil War. He was not a celebrated figure. He was a government employee with a specific problem to solve and very little money to solve it with. The problem was that the United States Army had hundreds of thousands of muzzle-loading rifle muskets in its warehouses, bought and issued for the war, obsolete the moment the war ended. Congress had no appetite for funding new weapons. The Army needed a way to make the rifles it already owned into something a soldier could use in the modern age of metallic cartridges and breech-loading mechanisms. Allen looked at what he had and designed around the limitation. He milled away the top rear of the barrel and attached a hinged breech block that flipped forward to load. It worked like a trapdoor. The nickname stuck before anyone gave it an official designation. Erskine Allen was 43 years old in 1865. He had worked at the Springfield Armory since he was 20. He understood what it meant to build something that soldiers in the field would beat against rocks and drag through mud and curse at in the rain, and then depend on when the moment arrived. His conversion was not elegant. A truly elegant solution would have started from scratch. Starting from scratch required money Congress would not provide. What Allen built instead was a solution that lived inside the constraints of the possible. It was simple enough to manufacture at scale. It was robust enough to survive hard field use. The breech block conversion could be performed on rifles already in inventory, at a fraction of the cost of new production. The Army tested 99 rifle designs over 2 years and adopted a refinement of Allen's mechanism in 1873 alongside a new cartridge developed at Springfield Armory for the purpose. The cartridge was the .45-70 government. He would spend the rest of his life watching the Army argue about whether what he built was good enough. He died in 1879. 4 years after the cavalry began issuing his design to soldiers on the frontier. The .45-70 was not subtle about what it could do. The cartridge designation told the story in plain numbers. 45 was the bullet diameter in decimal inches. 70 was the powder charge in grains of black powder. A 405-grain lead bullet driven at 1,350 feet per second. It had a rainbow trajectory past 300 yards that any trained soldier understood and calculated for. At close range, it was a different matter. At close range, a 45-70 bullet did not behave like a modern rifle cartridge. It behaved like something between a bullet and a small projectile fired from a cannon. Animals and men hit with it at close range did not question what had struck them. They went down. Buffalo hunters on the plains understood this. The army understood it on the frontier. The cartridge did the job it was built to do for 20 years of Plains Wars service, and then the world changed around it. A corporal who had served on the frontier through the 1880s had something his father had not imagined. A posting from the commanding officer in 1890 announcing that the army was conducting trials to find a replacement for the trapdoor and the 45-70. The European armies had smokeless powder. The Europeans had bolt-action repeating rifles that could put 5 rounds through the action in the time it took a trapdoor carbine to cycle 2. A cavalry trooper on a horse carrying a single-shot black powder rifle in a world where the next war would be fought by men with magazines and smokeless powder understood what the announcement meant. His weapon was going to change. He had been issued the trapdoor at his first posting. He had learned its particular rhythm: open the block, extract the spent case, seat the fresh cartridge, close the block, cock the hammer. He could do it without looking. He could do it in the dark, on horseback, with one hand. He had practiced until the motion was as automatic as breathing. None of that practice was going to matter in the next war, and he knew it. What the corporal reading that announcement did not know was how long the transition would actually take, or how many times the army would declare the 45-70 finished before the cartridge finally agreed. Washington, D.C. 1892. The army convened a board in New York in December of 1890 to find a replacement for the trapdoor and the 45-70. The board compared more than 50 designs over the course of 18 months. The rifle they selected was the Krag Jorgensen, a Norwegian bolt-action design chambered in a new cartridge called the 30-40 Krag, the Army's first smokeless powder round. The decision was official in 1892. Production began at Springfield Armory in 1894. The 45-70 was finished. The Ordnance Department had drawn the line and the new era had begun. 4 years later, America went to war with Spain. There were not enough Krags. The volunteer regiments mobilizing across the country were issued trapdoor Springfields from the warehouses the army had been trying to empty since the adoption of the Krag. Isaiah Thompson and the men of the 24th Infantry carried them up San Juan Hill. The first attempt to kill the 45-70 had produced the rifle that replaced it, but the 45-70 was still there, in the hands of soldiers, in a real war, doing real work. San Juan Hill, Cuba, July 1st, 1898. The Spanish defenders on the heights were armed with 7mm Mauser Model 1893 bolt-action rifles. Smokeless powder. Stripper clip loading. The sound of Spanish Mauser fire was described by American soldiers who heard it as a high-pitched crack and whine, the sound of high-velocity projectiles moving through air faster than any weapon they had faced before. American regular troops with Krag rifles were at a disadvantage against the Mauser. Buffalo soldiers with trapdoor Springfields firing black powder were at a greater one. The 45-70's black powder charge produced a visible cloud of smoke with every shot. In the Spanish trenches, every soldier carrying a trapdoor announced his position to the defenders above every time he fired. What those soldiers accomplished at San Juan Hill and Kettle Hill, they accomplished despite their weapons, not because of them. The army looked at what happened to its men on those hills and drew its conclusions. The second attempt to kill the 45-70 began the day the war ended. The army moved to purge the old cartridge from inventory entirely. The Springfield Model 1903 and the 30-06 replaced the Krag and the 30-40 in 1903. the Army swept out the old generation of cartridges and put the new standard in place. Surplus trapdoor Springfields went to National Guard armories, to military schools, to training commands. Some went to Indian reservations, where men who had once faced the trapdoor across a battle line now received them as surplus hunting rifles. The Army considered the matter settled. The 4570 was no longer a military cartridge. It was a relic. The third attempt had succeeded, or so the Ordnance Department believed. The 4570 had not read the report. The straight wall case, the simple geometry, the versatility of a bore big enough to accept bullets from 300 grains to 500 and beyond. The reliability of an architecture that had been engineered around the constraints of wartime budget shortfalls and had survived every test the frontier threw at it. These qualities did not become irrelevant, because a procurement board said they did. Hunters and guides in the American West were not interested in what the Ordnance Department believed. They were interested in what stopped a grizzly bear or a bison at 40 yards in heavy brush. The 4570 stopped both. By the time the Army had officially retired the cartridge, the civilian market had adopted it so thoroughly that ammunition manufacturers never stopped producing it. The Ordnance Department declared the cartridge obsolete. The Marlin Arms Company chambered the Model 1895 lever-action rifle for it in 1895, 2 years after the Army formally moved on. The civilian market understood something the Ordnance Department did not. The 4570's limitations at long range were real. Its authority at close range was not a limitation. It was a promise. You already know which side of this you are on. You have always known. There is an argument as old as the American military about what makes a weapon worth keeping. The Ordnance Department argues from the front of the trajectory, from velocity and range and modern ballistic tables and the performance of enemy rifles in the next anticipated conflict. The man carrying the rifle argues from the other end of the trajectory, from what happens when the animal or the man on the other side of the brush stops moving. Both arguments are correct for different situations. The 4570 lost every Ordnance Department argument it was ever entered into. It is still here. After World War I, the Army conducted what amounted to a fourth systematic purge of older military hardware from the inventory. Trapdoor Springfields that had lingered in armory corners and National Guard storage rooms were cleared out. The official military history of the 4570 government as an infantry cartridge was declared complete. The ordnance community understood the matter as resolved. What they did not account for was the Navy. The United States Navy had been using modified trapdoor Springfield rifles as line-throwing guns, devices that propel a line from one vessel to another during at-sea operations, since the late 19th century. The 4570 blank cartridge drove the projectile and the attached rope with exactly the force and reliability the task required. The Navy kept the 4570 not out of sentiment, but out of function. The blank cartridge designation that resulted was the Cartridge, caliber 45, line-throwing, Model 32. It is still in production. The United States Navy and the United States Coast Guard use it today. The fifth attempt was never a formal declaration. It was the accumulated weight of a century of procurement cycles that simply moved past the old cartridge without ever fully accounting for it. Modern high-velocity small-caliber cartridges had replaced the 4570 in every infantry role the cartridge had ever held. There was no longer a debate to be had about whether modern military doctrine required a 400-grain bullet at moderate velocity. It did not. The Ordnance Department had been right about that since 1892. What the Ordnance Department had not anticipated was that the 4570 did not need military doctrine to survive. It needed the American hunter, the Alaskan guide, the brush country elk outfitter, the man walking into dense timber in country where a grizzly bear could close the distance between them faster than a bolt-action rifle could be cycled twice. For those men, the 45-70 had never been obsolete. Marlin kept building the 1895 for them. Henry built lever actions for them. The cartridge that the Army declared, finished in 1892, is being loaded today in Hornady factory ammunition, with a 325-grain polymer tip bullet traveling at 2,000 feet per second out of a lever action rifle with a stainless steel finish and a threaded barrel. There is a Marlin Model 1895 in a soft case in a truck outside a guide camp in south-central Alaska right now. The guide who owns it has carried it for 11 seasons. He has used it twice. The first time, the client made a clean shot at a bull moose and the rifle was not needed. The second time, something came out of an alder thicket at 10 yards and the rifle was very much needed, and the 45-70 did what it was built to do in 1873 on an army budget that had no room for elegance. That rifle carries a scope and a sling and modern synthetic ammunition loaded by a company that did not exist when Erskine Allen was bending over a milling machine in Springfield, Massachusetts, trying to figure out how to make a modern breechloader out of a Civil War surplus muzzleloader. Allen died in 1879 at the age of 57. He had been the master armorer at the Springfield Armory for 14 years. He had built 5 generations of the trapdoor design through successive models and refinements, and he had done it all on government wages inside the constraints of appropriations budgets that allowed nothing extravagant. He never saw the frontier service his design performed. He never saw the 45-70 do its work against the grizzled country that stretched from the Missouri River to the Pacific. He never saw his cartridge outlive every attempt to replace it. He got a government pension and a death notice in the Springfield papers, and nothing more. That rifle runs on a cartridge that traces its dimensions to a decision made by Springfield Armory engineers in 1873 to chamber a bore at .458 of an inch and load it with 70 grains of black powder under a 405-grain lead bullet. That decision was made because Erskine Allen had already spent years working out how to build something that worked within constraints that did not allow for starting over. The budget did not permit new designs. The warehouses were full of Civil War muskets. The solution had to begin with what was already there. Allen started there and built forward. And what he built forward into was a cartridge so deeply suited to close-range stopping power that no subsequent ordnance decision could make it irrelevant to the men who needed exactly that. The cartridge that emerged from those constraints outlasted the rifle it was designed for. The replacement rifle that replaced it. The replacement for that replacement, and 5 separate institutional attempts to close the file. The file is still open. 2 men around a fire somewhere in the Alaskan backcountry. One of them carries a modern bolt-action rifle in 6.5 Creedmoor, and will tell anyone who asks that the flat trajectory and the light recoil and the precision accuracy of a modern cartridge at 400 yards represent everything the 45-70 cannot do. The other man carries the Marlin and will tell anyone who asks that at 10 yards in the alders. The argument about 400-yard trajectory is not the relevant argument. Both of them are right. Both of them inherited the argument from men who had the same argument in different words, going back to the ordnance trials of 1890. Neither of them knows the name of the man who designed the hinged breech block that started all of it, who died in 1879 without seeing the cartridge he helped bring into the world outlast every successor the Army tried to put in its place. The procurement record says retired. The field record says something else entirely. Allen, the 24th Infantry. Isaiah Thompson on a hill in Cuba carrying the rifle the Army had already decided to kill. The cartridge is still in service. The men who made it necessary are not on the record. They never were.